The 2026 South Carolina Senate race has been in the news cycle for the past month, ever since former Senator Lindsey Graham passed away, and notably for the reason, obviously, of his sister being appointed as an interim replacement to his Senate seat. And ultimately, she has announced that she's going to run for this Senate race to serve a full 6-year term in the United States Senate and trying to be that Republican nominee for the November elections. So, with that said, I want to go ahead and talk about this new poll out from Emerson College that was released today. This has some very interesting points on it, and I think it's worth taking a look at some of those. So, for starters, the South Carolina poll has Ralph Norman up 22% to Graham's 19%. But more importantly, what I wanted to point out from reading this a little bit is that actually a majority of voters, according to this poll from Emerson College, remember, pretty reliable pollster, a majority of voters, 53%, say that Trump's endorsement of Graham actually has no impact on their vote. 29% did say that they would be more likely to support the candidate that Trump endorsed, and then 18% said that they would be less likely to support the candidate that Trump endorsed. But most importantly, this number of 53% saying that Trump's endorsement of Graham makes no impact on their personal vote and who they decide to vote for in this election. So, interesting enough, the leading two candidates in this race are Ralph Norman and Darlene Graham, as I mentioned before. And if you remember Ralph Norman, he actually ran for the governor's race a couple weeks ago in the primary, ultimately got eliminated before the runoff. Pamela Evett and Alan Wilson moved on to that runoff, but Ralph Norman came in third place in that race, receiving about 17% of the vote. Now, this is significant, too, because he's decided to run for the Senate race now after losing that governor's race, and seeing the likelihood of him coming in and being that Republican nominee, in my opinion, seems pretty low, especially considering that the candidate that he's running against happens to be the sister to the late Senator Graham. I think that it's more likely that she ultimately wins this primary, but I think the polling averages and everything really matters in this race, and I think it's worth noting. So, with that said, I want to talk about some of these. I want to talk about the special Republican primary in general. So, Lindsey Graham, who passed away in July, ultimately triggered a statewide special primary election. People have been a little confused on the process of this, but ultimately South Carolina's law makes it a requirement for there to be a special primary election. So, in this case, Senator Graham, the new Senator Graham, Darlene Graham, will ultimately be on this ballot to run against other Republicans. And similar to the regular primary, if no candidate receives a majority by in that original vote cast, there will be a runoff election between the top two finishers, and that would be held on August 25th. Now, according to these polling, that's pretty likely. But first and foremost, this primary election is set to take place in less than 2 weeks on August 11th. So this process has been really, really fast since Senator Graham passed away. And ultimately, it's going to really trigger a lot of, shall I say, chaos in a lot of ways. Over the next little under 2 weeks, as we get into this August 11th special primary race. So with that said, I also want to take a look at two specific factors. One of them is the 2020 election in South Carolina, where former Senator Graham was on the ballot, winning over 10% to Harrison in that race, Jamie Harrison, in that race for South Carolina back then. So this was the 2020 election primary, and if this race sounds slightly familiar if you've been in politics for a while, it's because the fact that South Carolina actually was pretty close in this race. Now, the 10% margin may have you believe otherwise, but polling actually said that this race was going to be closer than it was. In fact, some really reliable pollsters going into the final days of this campaign back in 2020 ultimately said that this race was going to be a toss-up, some saying tilt Republican, lean Republican, 538 being the only likely Republican, and that was changed November 2nd, 2020. So, Important nonetheless. But if you look at the polling in general, ultimately Jamie Harrison was staying right with Lindsey Graham in a lot of these polling, sometimes even beating him in polling as well. So why do I point this out? Well, I point it out because 2020 was, sure, a Democratic year. Democrats won statewide in multiple different states, and ultimately on the presidential level, they won that race with Joe Biden as the presidential nominee for the Democrats, and they scored key Senate victories and House victories as well. But ultimately, it wasn't this blowout election year that some people may have you believe. In fact, it was a lot closer than a lot of people realize. Like I said before, polling had this race neck and neck, but ultimately, Senator Graham won by 10.3 percentage points back in 2020. Similar situation happened in Maine, where Susan Collins ran, and Sarah Gideon was expected to win this race, but ultimately lost it. Sure, Democrats won statewide, they won on the national level back in 2020, but not by the margins that people may have you believe, and certainly not in states like South Carolina and Maine that were considered key states, that were considered states that Democrats really had an opportunity at. They were proven wrong back in 2020. But 2026 is a very different election year. We're coming out of a Trump presidency into this midterm election where voters are given the opportunity to put their say on how the president has done over the past 2 years and whether they want to continue with Republican leadership or change things up. Ultimately, a lot of people have said they want to change things up. That's according to polling, betting odds, etc. And in prior elections, if we look back at the 2025 governor's races in Virginia and New Jersey, they were proven that Democrats nationwide want a change in leadership. They're ready for that change. Trump narrowly lost Virginia by about 5 percentage points back in the 2024 presidential race. Abigail Spanberger comes in and wins by 15 percentage points as a Democrat just a year after he was elected president. So there's no argument really here that Democrats are performing very well on the national level. The question I have is, does that momentum carry into states like South Carolina? Of course, if we go to our VoteHub averages, give me one moment to backtrack on here, and we go to the Senate race, they're going to tell you that this race is about a 91% chance that the Republicans win this, looking about a 10% margin, that's similar to back in 2020. So not much has changed, arguably, according to at least polling and the forecasting according to VoteHub. But I think this race actually might be a little closer than what they're telling you. And I think that because of polling. Another impact that this race has is the general election polling. Democratic-sponsored polling from Annie Andrews. So again, very clear, want to be very open about these. These are Democratic-sponsored polls. All of these that I'm showing right here, all Democratic sponsors. You can read it right under it. But Annie Andrews has actually performed pretty well in these Democratic-sponsored polls. And of course, I'd give these, probably about 5% to the right. So in this case, this would put the Republican about 2% up. In this case, about 2% up. In this case, about 4% up, etc. You get the point. But Ralph Norman and Annie Andrews, when there was a poll conducted between them two in the public policy polling, Democratic sponsor, Annie Andrews was only losing by about a percentage point. If we use my metric of going back about 5%, that's still only losing by about 6 percentage points. And sure, that's still a loss, but it's significant nonetheless, and a race that Democrats could start to pay attention to as this race heats up, and we really determine who might be the nominee. So, with that said, I want to know what your thoughts are. Do you guys believe that this race in South Carolina is a slam dunk for Republicans, or do you believe that there's a chance that a Democrat could upset? Of course, the whole point of this video is to talk about this Senate primary election poll, and certainly also this impact that majority of voters are saying that Trump's endorsement of Graham has no impact on their personal vote. Do you believe that Ralph Norman actually might win this race after the current incumbent senator, sure appointed, but the incumbent was appointed just weeks prior? Do you believe that Ralph Norman actually could win this primary race? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I love reading through your thoughts and seeing where you guys stand on these races. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the national level as well going into the November elections. How do you think that Republicans perform in South Carolina without Lindsey Graham on the ballot? I'd love to read through those don't forget to make sure to like and subscribe on the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.